Okay, so welcome to the Adventures in Awareness podcast. And today I'm super happy to have Jessica Corneille. Am I pronouncing that right?
Corneille, but that's fine. Nobody.
Okay. Say that again. Corneille.
Corneille. Yeah, it's
Okay, great. Yeah, and I'll just read your bio if that's okay to introduce you. Jessica is a research psychologist specializing in spontaneous spiritual awakening experiences. She graduated with a master's degree in psychology from the University of Greenwich, where she focused her studies on altered states of consciousness. She has a passion to bridge the worlds of science and spirituality. Her mission is to challenge the default pathologist, help me out,
categorization. It's a difficult
yes,
word.
yeah, yeah, of awakening experiences by helping to inform and encourage mainstream psychology to look beyond the current designated spectrum of normality, to encompass the transpersonal as well as something that is intrinsic to human experience. Jessica recently published her research on the phenomenology, individual differences, and well-being effects of spontaneous spiritual awakenings with Dr. David Luke, and has given a number of talks on her work, including with the British Psychological Society. She works for the Scientific and Medical Network and Galileo Commission, and is a collaborator of the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium and Spiritual Crisis Network, and a certified Kundalini Yoga teacher. And I'll just say, I found out about your work because your paper that you had released on spontaneous spiritual awakenings just showed up on my Facebook newsfeed. And I saw that David Luke had co-authored it, and I had known David Luke from my previous work with Psychedelic Society, had done some stuff there. I just thought, oh, great, it'd be amazing to have a talk. And then, of course, Jessica came and did a talk for Psychedelic Society, which I was enthralled by. And at the start of that talk, you gave a kind of very brief intro to your personal experience with this, which my understanding is you had to keep it quite brief so you could get into the scientific data. But I just thought it would be amazing to have a slightly longer conversation and have a chance to dig into that.
Yeah, sure. So would you like to hear about my own experience?
Yeah, that's okay. So just to say, well, yeah, maybe just dive in if you tell the story now.
Okay, sure. Um, I'll give a brief summary because I feel like I could talk for years about this experience that I've had, and that's still ongoing because it's something that never really leaves people once they've had it. But in short, it was about 6 years ago now. It was February the 20th, 2016. I was in Madrid, and I had just moved to Madrid actually for a new job, and was starting a new life journey. But I was an atheist, and I was doing, lots of really interesting stuff, but meeting new people predominantly, going out, drinking, doing lots of really, really cool, exciting stuff. So I was living in a really exciting period of my life. Um, and I wasn't practicing any spiritual practices at the time or anything like that. And I wasn't engaged in that kind of world, really, to be honest. I had practiced yoga a few years prior to that, and I've been practicing it now for 10 years. So it's something that has been in my life, but it's not something that was dominant in my life at that time at all. And if anything, the reasons why I had practiced yoga before was for the physical aspect and because it was something that everybody else was doing. So I jumped on that bandwagon as everybody else did. But on the 20th of February 2016, the night before, so I went to bed, I slept and I had a really intense lucid dream. And in my talk from December, I discussed the dream a little bit. But it was basically very similar to the dream Waking Life, in that I was floating through this void and I was encountering lots of different characters in my lucid dream. And I was asking them all the same question because it was lucid. I was aware that I could speak as well as receive and listen and change and modify the dream. So I was floating around and I was asking the same question to everybody. What is the meaning of life? And one person would answer one thing, another person would answer another thing, and the answers were really incredibly eloquent. And that was one of the key features of the responses, is that they felt like they weren't considered by myself, they weren't expressed by myself, they couldn't have been expressed by myself because they were so beautifully expressed and so deeply philosophical. And whilst I had always been philosophical before and always considered the nature of life and reality, but I could have never come up with those kinds of answers. And so traveling through time and space and asking the same question, what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of life? I kept getting all these beautiful responses in response to my question. And in the last scene of my lucid dream, let's say, I encountered the main character from Waking Life, actually, from the film, which I had watched a few weeks prior. And I asked him the question, what is the meaning of life? And he said, just wake up. And I actually did wake up from my dream. And when I opened my eyes, and this wasn't an intellectual thought or a theoretical idea, it's not like I woke up and I suddenly thought, oh, what an interesting dream. I wonder what the meaning of life is. No, that's not what happened. So I woke up and I experienced this immense feeling of oneness, of interconnection with everything and everyone, both the animate and the inanimate. So even I felt a deep connection even with all the objects in my room, with my bed, with the glass of water beneath on my bedside table, with the walls. And it was the most profound experience I've ever had in my entire life, this feeling of interconnection, of absolute embodied oneness. And I could see the objects in my room almost pulsating with a life force or a life energy. What I came to realize later on is what is usually referred to as the Brahman in Hinduism and in other sort of in yogic circles. Anyway, so I experienced this life force and this life energy, and it was as though everything around me was vibrating and pulsating with life. And the colors were extremely vivid. The shines and the hues that were coming in through the cracks of my window, were almost blinding. I could see every speck of dust in the air from the other side of the room. And I could see things with such clarity. It was really as though a veil had been lifted from my eyes, and I could finally see with my own eyes what there truly was around me, but also with my mind and with my body what this life is truly about, which is it's incredibly sacred. And actually, there are no words to define what I experienced truly, because the very essence of this experience is that it's absolutely ineffable. So there are no words to express a state that we don't normally in our typical waking life experience. And language hasn't been developed to kind of express those kinds of experiences in an adequate form. So anyway, I had an extreme epiphany that morning. I knelt down on the bed and I started crying for hours and hours, or it felt like hours. It was probably more like minutes. I'm not actually quite sure. Time and space moved in very odd ways, particularly time. And I actually don't know how long I was crying for, but I felt this intense gratitude for being alive, for being surrounded by life, by other life forms, by other non-life forms. I felt intense gratitude even, again, to the walls, the four walls around me, and the ceiling that was holding me in this space. In my cocoon. I don't know. I just felt like we often walk through life and we don't notice the small things that are actually the most essential things, and that they're what truly makes us happy. The sense of security, a sense of love, and so on. And I just felt this intense love for everything and everyone in the universe. And I felt as though that love was endless and it could multiply to infinity. So that's kind of the experience of that day, but it lasted for many weeks and even many months, and then for many years. It's still with me right now. So what I always tell people is that whereas before the experience I was operating on a wave like this, as everybody typically does, I wasn't depressed or anything like that before my experience, but I was sort of up and down. And ever since, I've been operating still with the ups and downs, but from a different level. Also, I had this intense realization that there were multiple layers of consciousness or of reality that one could experience, and that this was something that is intrinsic within every human. So it was not just an experience that I could feel. I didn't have this, sort of Jesus complex where I thought I was the chosen one, even though it did feel like I was blessed, absolutely blessed. But I realized intuitively, again, almost as a download, that this was something that was possible for every human being on this planet to experience, whether that be in birth, in death, or in between, anytime in between, if you're lucky. So, I mean, I got so many insights since that experience, and I could go on forever, but maybe you want to ask me some questions.
Yeah, there's so many questions, and I think I'm thinking maybe we can kind of almost spiral. So that was like the first round in the story, and we'll just do the story again, but I'll just kind of go into some more of the details. Like we'll kind of spiral into it because every single aspect of the story is fascinating to me. And maybe we'll just set up the context a little bit more, if that's okay. So just in case anyone has any doubt, because it sounds to me it was like just a dream. You had no reason to expect it to show up. It's not like you were doing a lucid dream practice, or were you? Or you weren't drunk that night. You hadn't taken a bunch of drugs the day before or something. It was all just like
So no drugs, no alcohol. Nothing particular happened the day before, or the week before, or even the month before. I mean, the only thing that really was different in my life is the fact that I had moved country about, a few weeks or a month prior to the experience. So perhaps there was an element of, me not seeing an imprint of my previous life onto my four walls or onto my new life. And it was almost like there was a blank canvas through which life could rewrite itself. But that's analyzing a little bit. No, just to back up a bit. Yeah, no, I was completely sober, and I wasn't lucid dreaming intentionally. It just happened. I'd been able to lucid dream in the past, and I've always had very profound, very symbolic dreams, particularly of the cosmos and of aliens and things like that as a child. So I've always been very connected to the dream world and very interested and intrigued by the dream world. And I write down a dream diary all the time. But it was absolutely, that night was not at all, it was not trying to reach or attain any sort of state, or even attain a lucid dream state. I just wanted to sleep. I just went to bed. And then I woke up and everything was different.
And was that a question, like, does it make sense to you that you were asking, what is the meaning of life? Is it a question that you'd carried around a lot? Or was that another surprising aspect of the dream? Like, I don't normally go around asking everyone, what is the meaning of life?
I don't normally ask people, or I didn't normally ask people what the meaning of life was, but I had always been pretty philosophical in that I'm a thinker. I think a lot. But I was an absolute complete atheist before my experience. So, whereas I'd sit down and contemplate a lot, I never associated contemplation with any form of spirituality. I was just interested in and curious at life and understanding life. But no, I was, full atheist. And actually, if you talk to me before my experience about anything related to spirituality or religion, I would have laughed in your face. I really didn't want to have anything to do with that. I thought it was fake. I didn't know what it was about, basically. And then from one moment to the next, from one night to the next morning, something shifted in my mind, in my perception of life, to the most profound degree. It affected every aspect of my life almost. So, yeah.
Wow. And then the next question I'm super curious about is, because you mentioned all these characters in the dream, were they humanoid, or were they anyone you recognized? Were they characters you knew? Were they surprises?
The only character I knew and I recognized, which is funny because he's just an actor basically in the film Waking Life, but it was the main character from Waking Life. But before that, and I spoke to dozens and dozens and dozens of people. They were not humanoids; they were humans, and I knew intuitively that they were philosophers, mathematicians, psychiatrists, psychologists. I knew that they were kind of big thinkers, basically, and involved in science and in the humanities. So I knew that they were sort of sort of big thinkers is what I would say. I can't really, and I
and
don't.
contemporary, like historical characters or contemporary to our time.
I don't know, because I don't know whether they were actual real people that I'd read about in the past or not. I mean, it was sort of like they were just people that I knew to be, intellectuals basically. But I don't know if they came from the past or from the present or whatever. I don't really know if that has much of a. It's an super interesting question. I've not actually asked myself that question, but it's not really probably relevant to what they were saying, because I think it's an age-old question. It's since the beginning of time.
Yeah.
People have been asking themselves that question. So it's
And you were saying the answers were so eloquent and beautiful, and not things that you think you would have thought of yourself. Do you remember any of these? Did you write them down? Like, I love that last one. The meaning of life is wake up when you wake up. It's so cool. But yeah, did you remember any of the other kind of
qualities of
warm-up acts?
it is such a shame. I think I was so involved. I was fully in this state when I woke up, this altered state, let's say, that I wasn't thinking with my mind. It was a pure experience. So I wasn't thinking, oh, I need to write this down, I need to analyze the dream. It was such it was a fully embodied experience that I gave my entire attention to without wanting to give my attention to it. It just, it manifested in that way. And I didn't think with my mind for, that entire day and then for the weeks to follow. That's not to say that I wasn't capable of doing normal routine-y stuff or going to work and other things. So I was still, able to manage this realm, let's say. But I was so happy and so peaceful, and I just knew that nothing mattered really, and yet everything matters at the same time. It's like there's a big cosmic joke going on, and we take ourselves too seriously. So even when there were sort of quarrels at work, I just didn't care. I was like, okay, everything kind of flew above my head, all the sort of nastier stuff and all the beautiful stuff I was so able to appreciate. And even just being on the metro in the morning for an hour, I loved that. I experienced such beauty there. That state kind of opens up the realization of what really is happening. And what is happening is that there's an unfolding of beauty occurring at every second of every microsecond of this world, and it's just continuously unfolding, and the moment you pay attention to it is when you are able to fully experience it.
And you mentioned that it lasted weeks and then months, and in some ways still is carrying on, but you often kind of talk a little bit in past tense, like it was this, it was that. So to what extent, when you say it or the experience of the inside is still alive in you today, how is that different from then? What is still the same? Is the computer pulsating with life? And can you see the specks of dust on the other side of the room, or does that calm down a little bit?
It's probably my room's a bit messy. The reason I say weeks and then months and then years is because I feel like it's sort of leveled down in some ways. It settled into a new way of being, basically, which is why it's still with me. And not with me with inverted commas, fully with me. It's just integrated in my everyday life. So everything I do, everything I think about comes from that space and from the philosophy that I learned and from the experience that I gained of that experience. But I'm not in permanent bliss state, in a permanent wow experience of life. But, when I do realize it, if I do sit down and kind of take a breather, I do go back to that state in many respects. So even the sort of intensity of it hasn't left me fully. It's just more manageable, more sort of grounded, let's say.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned you hadn't really been involved in spiritual circles, this kind of thing. I'm just wondering, so, and now you really are, you work for, how did you, do you want to say a little bit how you found David Luke, how you found this course, how you found people that could help maybe make sense of what you're saying? Did your immediate circle think you were crazy? Were you able to talk about it to anyone?
That's it's a question I always struggle with because, again, there are actually so many levels to this, to the unfolding of me getting to know David Luke and how people reacted to it and what I felt I needed to integrate the experience. My close circle was very understanding. I didn't tell many people actually initially. I only told a couple of people who are extremely close to me, and they accepted it, and they were, uh, they were understanding of it in many ways. So that was really, I think that was the most helpful thing that could have happened to me at the time, because whilst I knew exactly what was happening to me, I I suppose to some extent we all need that validation that we're not going crazy, that we're not losing our minds, because society, at least in the West, contemporary Western society, is not really a safe or a good container for these experiences. And of course, gradually we're becoming more and more attuned to the spiritual through yoga classes and so on and so forth. But still, these experiences are not really discussed. Mystical experiences are still tabooed a lot of the time, particularly in the West. So that was really, really helpful for me, just to know that, okay, whatever I'm going through right now, and I love it, and I'm in the best state possible. This is the happiest I've ever been. It's the most blissful I've ever been, and I'm experiencing a direct form of life rather than always being in the future or in the past. It was useful to have that grounding force of, yeah, okay, it's whatever happens, whatever I experience, it's okay. I'm accepted. I'm loved. It's all good. And yeah, so I only told it a couple of people in my close circles. I didn't really tell my extended friends or anything like that at the time, because I just didn't feel like they would understand. And I didn't feel the need to. I didn't need their validation. And I was still sort of in this absolute, in this heightened state of consciousness, and I didn't feel I really needed to discuss it with people. About a year after, I just felt like I needed to find community, and I felt like I needed to expand, to meet other people who might have had the experience, because I started reading more and more about the experience towards the end of that year. And I realized that, hey, as intuitively experienced and as I know already through, the feelings that I had about it, but more and more people than I thought originally had or are having these experiences, I'd like to reach out to them. So I reached out to an organization called ASSIST. It's the American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experiences. It's a very long title. I reached out to them and I said, I'd like to get in touch with somebody. I also felt I needed a bit of grounding, even though I was absolutely fine really in my everyday life, but I just felt I needed that kind of community. And I emailed them and they responded, and just to get their response was enough for me to feel grounded again and to feel validated and reassured that everything was okay. And they directed me to a Facebook group, and there I met, thousands of people who had had similar types of experiences. And that was really beautiful. And we've been a community since, and since that particular experience, I realized that if I wanted to work on raising awareness of these experiences, that I needed to start talking openly about my experience. So I did, and the more I did, the more I found other people who had some form of spiritually transformative experience, including intense mystical experiences, whether that be through psychedelics or through meditation or through some other form of spiritual contemplative practice or whatever. That there were more people out there than I thought who'd had it. And upon speaking about it with a friend called Josh, who I really adore, I don't even know if he knows how important he's been on my journey. He's sort of unlocked certain doors for me. But for instance, he's the one who told me about David Luke and about David Luke's work. And whilst Dave wasn't working on spontaneous spiritual awakening experiences, he was a psychologist, a well-established psychologist who was working on, things like parapsychology and other anomalous type experiences and spiritual experiences. So I knew that I needed to get in touch with him because I wanted to start working as a psychologist to try and sort of demystify mystical experiences within mainstream psychology. So I got in touch with him, and he was extremely helpful and wonderful. And we met up and talked about, the sort of course that I was looking for. And sure enough, I knew immediately that that was the university for me to go to was Greenwich University, where he was teaching and where I knew he could be my mentor, basically. And so that's the long story of how I met Dave. And
Yeah. So you were already a psychologist. You'd already had that.
no, sorry, that wasn't very clear. I wasn't a psychologist, so it took me about. So I stayed working in the arts and in cultural heritage for about a year and a half to 2 years after my experience. But the whole time I was planning, what am I going to do with this? I really, and it wasn't even a thought like, oh, I've had this experience now. I need to bring it on to others. It was even more profound and raw than that. It was a driving force towards that kind of goal to help other people who are undergoing these experiences, who might not have had the same kind of level of support that I have had. So, and for other motives. So that's why I got in touch with Dave, was because I knew I wanted to undertake a psychology degree, but I wanted to undertake it in the right university with the right professors that would support me. And within Greenwich, there's also Oliver Robinson, who does, work on the mind, body, and soul, and other aspects of, maybe more spiritual type experiences through the lens of psychology. So it was a no-brainer.
Great.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll ask you a couple of questions about your paper in a sec, but I'm also curious. So in your use of the word awakening, would you use that word also for someone who'd had like a really bombastic spiritual experience, but then it seems to kind of get lost, and some people are forever mourning that it's not there, or they're yearning for it, or it's a nice memory, but in your case something has persisted, but there's certainly people that have very large experiences that then the next week they're sunk back into whatever misery they were in before. Would you still use the word awakening for that, or do you have a different terminology?
It's a very subjective term. I would say that yes. I mean, if it was an experience of oneness or of direct contact with something greater than oneself, or an experience of ego dissolution that has changed someone's perspective and philosophy of life, even if they don't do anything with that experience, or even if they sink back into, say, depression afterwards, a week after, or a few days after, or even a year later, I think I would still consider it an awakening experience, though it obviously depends on the subjective interpretation and experience.
Yeah. And do you know Buddha at the gas pump, this kind of American pump? Yeah. So it's always a little bit, I mean, it's true of many of these kind of communities, but I just so happen to get that on my newsfeed sometimes. So I see that there'll be all these arguments between people of like, look, this is the real enlightenment, and if you were enlightened, this would happen, and my guru is more enlightened than your guru, and someone else claiming to have had an experience, and someone else saying, no, that's wrong, it's not the real one because you're still using a pronoun I, so yeah. I don't know how familiar you are with that whole kind of, from my perspective, it's all a bit kind of depressing. Supposedly people have come into like universal love are nitpicking about these kind of things, but it is interesting at the same time that people have different understandings of the experience, of maybe the same experience, but also different. There's quite a lot of variation that is possible in this wide category of mystical experiences. So yeah, just wondering if you have a sense of where does your experience fit into that spectrum? Do you care? Is there like another level of enlightenment that you think, oh, maybe one day I'll get there, or yeah?
I mean, for myself and the majority of the people that I've spoken to who claim to have had spiritual awakenings or non-dual experiences, they cease to have a sort of guru that they believe in every single word that they say. So it ends up being a lot more about internal experience, which can be guided by certain figures and certain teachers and guides. But it's, once you've had an experience like that, typically you tend to become more of your own teacher rather than a seeker of an external teacher to tell you the ins and outs of life and the way to enlightenment. And people tend to become less religious after these experiences too. And that's been shown in various papers recently. Yeah. So it's interesting when people have those kinds of debates, who claim to have had those experiences. But again, I can't be the judge of other people's experiences. So, I believe that there are different levels of the experience, or it's rather than levels, it's a spectrum. You can have and it's super intense experience, or you might get a glimpse at the experience. Of course, the super intense, fully embodied experience might be more kind of life-changing than the glimpse, but yeah, the glimpse might still be life-changing in some aspects, and it might not necessarily, though, be enough to change someone's religious experience or religious belief, or belief on gurus or on spiritual teachers.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's curious as well, because I notice a lot of people, and maybe it's just kind of self-selecting because those are the people we hear about, famously Eckhart Tolle, this kind of thing, who will have an experience and they'll write a book or do a series of talks or this kind of thing, hoping that other people will experience life a little bit more like they are. But your focus has become more like, well, there's probably other people who kind of just fell into this by accident, and maybe they need some help or support or community. So yeah,
Yeah.
you go for it.
Yeah, so rather than wanting to be a guide, I'd rather be someone. I felt that my path was to sort of bring a deeper understanding of these experiences within mainstream psychology, because these experiences are typically pathologized and stigmatized within psychology, mainstream psychology. So clinical psychologists will typically, use more invasive means of helping people who are undergoing these kinds of extreme psychospiritual states. Psychiatrists might prescribe medication to help ease the intensity, which isn't always necessarily the right way. I don't believe. I'm not anti-psychiatric drugs. If one feels that they're really needed, if one feels that they're having an extremely negative experience and it's persisting and they've tried everything else, and absolutely, I'm not against psychiatric drugs, but I do think they need to be a sort of last kind of point of action. Whereas at the moment, the way it goes is that if you've had a sort of intense spiritual awakening type experience, you go to the psychologist, and the psychologist will refer you to a psychiatrist who will prescribe you drugs. That's not always the case, but yeah. And also not even referring to the drug aspect, to the medicalization of these experiences, but also, if clinical psychologists, who are typically the first point of contact for people undergoing these experiences, if they're not aware that these experiences are actually possible, or that more people have them than is thought of, than is considered within mainstream psychology, then they won't be able to be sympathetic or empathetic towards the experiencer. And this might actually trigger more negative experiences for the person who's had the awakening. So it's important to inform people, mental health workers, and clinical psychologists and so on how to best deal with people undergoing these states. And that includes, being open-minded and open-hearted, and so on.
And do you have a sense or an indication of how that's being received so far? So you've written one paper so far, is that right?
Yeah. I'm in two other projects at the moment, but I've published one. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you get a sense already how, for lack of a better word, mainstream psychiatry or whichever audience you're hoping will assimilate this a little bit more, how it's being received so far? Do you kind of see it as an uphill battle, or is the culture shifting in such a direction that there's more openness to it?
I feel like the culture is shifting, particularly, I think research with psychedelics has really helped our mission, because I'm not alone in this mission of trying to sort of demystify mystical experiences that are a little bit more spontaneous or non-induced through psychedelics. So I, I really respect the whole, the people who are undertaking the research in the neuroscience and the psychology of psychedelic experiences, because that's really opened up people's minds to the possibility of human experience. And it's opened up the minds of many psychologists, and I'm generalizing here because not all psychologists are ignorant, but it has opened up many people's minds, basically, and it's enabled, I think, things like my work, like mine and David Luke's work, to be better received within the mainstream. I've only had really positive feedback, to be honest. Luckily, obviously, you get the odd sort of comment here and there, but I've been receiving lots of emails by people working in mental health and people who are psychologists and others who are psychiatrists, who have said that they really appreciate that this kind of work is being undertaken. The most important thing for me is that people who are undergoing these states find my paper and feel like they're not alone and gain that kind of validation as well. So I've been receiving emails by people who have had the experience, who are not necessarily working within mental health, and who say that it's been really helpful for them also to be able to share with their family members and friends so that they can feel better understood within their circles. So that's been the most gratifying kind of email that I've received and reception that I've received.
That's great. Yeah. And what are the other two, is it okay to say the other two projects you're working on?
It's the very early days,
Right.
but yeah. So probably
similar field.
I don't know yet. We're trying to do the sort of funding applications for it. So,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Okay. And so, yeah, as is obvious, I'm fascinated by the subject. And so when I saw your paper, I thought, well, it'd be cool just to hear it from you directly, and got in touch with you both to organize a talk. But I really didn't, I wasn't sure how many people would show up, because I was personally motivated to hear the talk. I didn't really care if 5 people show up. That's great. I get to hear the talk. But a lot more people showed up than I expected. That's one thing. And then the second thing, in the Q&A, it transpired, was very obvious from people's questions, that there were many, many people in the audience who had or were having something in the realm of these experiences. I think there was some 60 people that showed up online, and like combination online and offline. So I was like, oh, well, there's more. I also felt like, oh, there's more people out there having variations on these experiences, not necessarily with psychedelics, not because they've meditated. And some questions really did show how there could, as well as it being like a glorious thing, also quite alienating and confusing. And so with that context, I mean, feel free to comment on any aspect of that you like, but I'm also interested in just, okay, apart from just knowing that they're not alone and there's nothing wrong with them, would Assist be the first place that you would recommend people get in touch with, or are there other networks maybe in the UK that you think are useful?
That's a very important question. Yeah, so there are a number of organizations that are mushrooming at the moment. But Assist is really good for people who are based in the US. And then there's a Spiritual Crisis Network in the UK. They lead peer support groups online. They also, have a database of a collection of literature that people can refer to if they're undergoing these states. And they offer a number of other sort of helpful resources, and they can also connect people to psychologists, transpersonal psychologists who are specialized in dealing with people who undergo these kinds of experiences. That's the same for the International Spiritual Emergence Network. So that's another one to check out. They're also based in the UK, I believe. Or they're international, but I think the founders are in the UK. And there's a platform called Emerging Proud, which I adore, and it's run by Katie Mottram, who's a wonderful, pioneer of trying to get this information out to the mainstream and to the public. And basically, it's a blog, but it's a collection of videos and writing and articles of people who've undergone varying states of spiritually transformative experiences. So not necessarily non-dual experiences or awakening experiences, but also people who hear voices, or who, experience telepathy and so on and so forth. It's just, a platform to basically normalize and find community around these experiences that one might have. So those are really good resources that I would check out. And there are more, but there's also Blue Lotus, and they're online, and they run online peer support groups. And yeah.
Great. Well, maybe we'll put all the links. We'll gather the links and put them alongside the podcast. But yeah, that's so great. And just to come back to the whole, because you're saying spiritual experiences, but not necessarily non-dual experiences. I've read at least one academic, and I think it exists in some wisdom traditions as well, this distinction between, or even in Vedanta, my understanding is there's dualistic Vedanta, like Dvaita Vedanta, where the soul is somehow separate from God or the ultimate reality, and there can be much more dualistic, devotional, love-based kind of experience, or that's maybe the goal of what they're going for. And then there's this more non-dual, there is no kind of God outside of you to worship, in a sense. It's all kind of one, and you are that, and this kind of thing. There is no ego, and maybe some people would go so far as to say that because there's no ego and there's no soul, there's no free will, and everything's just unfolding. Do you have any comments or opinions, or from your personal experience, any sense of in which direction you feel more aligned? Or
I feel aligned with both and neither. I mean, I feel like if we're talking about oneness, then that also encompasses what's outside of us. So from personal experience and from personal belief that stems from that experience, it is a question of us being emitters of consciousness, and us being the receivers of consciousness. So everything is God in many respects, but I don't believe that that we are not God and that we should look outside of ourselves to find God. I believe that God exists within us, but equally, I believe that everything contains God. So, and I, even to say everything would imply a dualism, right? Because it would imply a separation. I just believe that everything is God.
Mm-hmm. And maybe it's just worth saying, because maybe at least I, several years ago, would have a very fixed idea of what God is, which would be based somewhat on the Bible. And it's like, but my impression is that's not necessarily what you mean.
No, and there's no real definition that I can put on that word. Consciousness, life, awareness, intelligence actually is something that came up a lot during the peak of my experience, that everything is intelligent. There is a sort of underlying intelligence, and that's the intelligence that makes plants grow. It's the intelligence that moves our planets around a solar system, around the sun. It's the intelligence that forms our cells and that makes us age. So, yeah.
And you're now a certified Kundalini teacher. I'm assuming you hadn't done that before. That's something that you found after.
Yeah, I actually had practiced it for a year, maybe 5 years before my experience. Yeah, so I found it at university, and there was a great teacher, but I didn't know what it was all about. I kind of chanted along, but it was almost funny for me, but it was a really beautiful experience, and I felt good afterwards. That I felt floaty afterwards, and that's why I kept going back. The teacher was excellent. But the time I truly found the meaning of Kundalini Yoga, what it was all about, was a year after my experience, the initial experience. I was looking for yoga classes. Like I said earlier, I was trying to find communities, and literally on my same block where I lived, there was this small yoga studio, and I saw this teacher inside, and he was beautiful, and he was wearing all white, and I just felt so drawn to that studio. And basically I started going to that studio, and I learned Kundalini from that, and I became a teacher a year later. It's a really epic form of yoga. I know all yoga forms are epic and incredible in their own way, but for me, Kundalini Yoga is the ultimate, and that's my personal experience. That's my personal view. But it's like alchemy. It grounds me when I need grounding, and it lifts me up when I need lifting up. So yeah.
And is motivation there? And maybe it's many, many things, but is it like, okay, I've got all these spiritual experiences, but I want like a healthy body? Or is it like, this will help induce or get some people closer to the experience, and that's part of the motivation? Or yeah, does it relate to your...
Certainly, yeah, definitely. It it does cultivate a sensitivity and a sensibility towards altered states of consciousness. And like I said, that was partly the reason why I became so obsessed with it a year after my experience, is that I felt that high again, which isn't necessarily healthy to chase highs, right? But, I felt really good, and I felt really in touch with that direct experience of life that I mentioned, and the oneness experience. So Kundalini Yoga, the whole aim of it is to reach that altered state. And you can reach it very quickly with Kundalini Yoga, which is why you need a teacher who knows how to pace themselves as well, because you don't want to open up too, you don't want to open someone up too quickly either. But yeah, that's the main attraction of Kundalini Yoga, but it's also incredible for the circulatory system, for building strength and stamina, for sex, it's really good for sexual kind of, it enhances sexuality, but it also moves that sexual energy to, for creativity. It's good for so many reasons. And there's a different, say, yoga recipe for every type of experience that you want to induce in people, or you want people to experience. It's very profound.
And I know there's probably nothing you could say that would be true in all cases, but if someone's had this or a similar experience, is there anything that you think will be useful for most people? Like, okay, you should go take a bunch of psychedelics, or you should meditate, or you should try Kundalini Yoga, or just like be quiet for some time? Or
is there anything like something that I would say helps, or
yeah, that you'd recommend, or maybe warn against?
Yeah, I think everybody, whilst we're all human beings, so we have similar emotions and similar triggers and whatever, I think one needs to find their own path. I don't know. I don't think there's a one size fits all. For most people, I would say psychedelics is probably really, beneficial and conducive to those experiences. But for others who perhaps already have a tendency for those experiences, and who might not already know that, might not be the best idea to take psychedelics. But I don't know, there's not been any research done really on the ideal personality type for things like psychedelics or intense Vipassana retreats or anything like that. I'd say, a really simple way of gradually cultivating the sense of oneness is to just be out in nature and spend some time alone out there, and observe and be curious and be fully present, cultivate presence through meditation and mindfulness. And I think often, with time, that really does sensitize you to the reality of this life. But there are many other means, even things like fasting can induce these experiences. Things like sleep deprivation might trigger these experiences. Mental illness might be conducive to those experiences, though I wouldn't recommend it.
Not the preferred route, yeah. And then I noticed on your biography, it says you're a collaborator of the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, which I think Daniel Ingram either started or is part of. And I interviewed him, it's probably almost a year ago now, on a bunch of topics, including this idea of no self and psychedelics and meditation and this kind of thing. So yeah, I'm just curious if you are allowed, or it's okay to say what form that collaboration is taking.
Well, it's a space where researchers come together, and we have monthly meetings or even bi-weekly meetings sometimes, I believe, where we discuss our own projects and projects that we want to work on. And then eventually you collaborate with people, and you might want to find funding and embark on a research project with another person. So it's a really good space to share ideas and feel inspired, but predominantly it was set up in order to to be able to more effectively link people up who are interested in researching similar topics.
Another question is because I've met people who have had a variation on this experience that you've described, and then in their own words, they've lost it, as it were. So some weeks or some months went by and suddenly life kind of went back to normal and they're desperate to get back there. Or, and I know other people who maybe have cultivated this experience through meditation or whatever, and then they won't touch psychedelics, or they won't, it's kind of, they protect it. They want to make sure that they don't lose this way of experiencing life. So I'm just curious if that has or is a concern for you, that you might kind of lose this way of being. And if you have people come up to you and say, I had that experience and oh my God, I want to get it back, what should I do?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I had that. I don't have that experience anymore. I don't feel that way anymore at all, because my experience is fully integrated in who I am today. So there's no way that it can leave me now. It's me. I've become it. It's become me. But I'd say when the heightened state, when the higher states of my experience started to wane and the experience started to integrate in my everyday life, which is a good thing, but I started to kind of miss that the sort of magic of the experience, because I started to experience things in that magic, but it became normal to me, right? And so I started to kind of feel like, oh, I'm losing it. I need to start thinking about it more. I need to hold on to that feeling. And actually what that was doing is that it was stopping me from being in the present, which is the whole point of those experiences. And I realized quite quickly afterwards that if I just let go and let it happen, that might just be beneficial for me. And it was, because the moment I let go, I mean, there was a really clear moment of me just agreeing with myself in many ways that, okay, now I'm going to let go of this feeling and whatever will be, will be. And the moment I did, I started to experience these beautiful senses of love again and of oneness. And it was amazing. So the best thing that one can do, according to my own experience, is to just trust and let go, which is difficult. But I've met many people who've had that, who have experienced what you've described, Amir, and it's quite distressing for people. I'd say that's one aspect of the crisis that might arise from these experiences. They can either come from the initial experience where people feel really surprised and challenged by the spiritual aspects of the experience that they've maybe perhaps not experienced in the past. And then they might occur during the integration phase when people are trying to make sense of the experience and start questioning the society and the structures that hold us in place. And they might also occur, as you say, through the chasing of the initial experience, of the high of those experiences. So it does occur, it does happen. And it's something that I didn't mention in my talk in December, and that someone rightfully mentioned in the comments at the end during the Q&A. And it really did spring back this memory of, I felt exactly that way. And I think it's perhaps something that I was trying to suppress, or that I had suppressed, because it's something that I've forgotten about since. But now that you reminded me, and that Adam, who asked me the question in December, reminded me, that's a very common feature post-experience, particularly during the integration phase, when it becomes part of an everyday life.
Yeah, great. Well, just thank you for making the time to delve into this a bit more. Obviously, I'm super looking forward to hoping that you get the funding for these two other projects, and looking forward to hearing about them, and maybe you'll come and do another talk when they're ready. Yeah. Is there anything else you kind of feel like it's been missed out, that you'd like to make sure is out there a bit? Mm-hmm.
I think you asked some really, really good questions and got me thinking. So thank you. And
it was a pleasure.
Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thank you.